and we'll get into it. So we'd like to welcome artist Megan Zettlemoyer to our virtual artist talk this evening. We currently have her paintings in our gallery right now, exhibition titled Living Ink. And I mean, just personally, it's been awesome getting to spend almost 2 months with these pieces. They're just gorgeous. And the name of the exhibition is definitely living up to the work. They are changing. Even in the short time that we've had them in the space, they're changing. So it's really cool to see that.
Thank you guys for having me and having my work in the gallery. It's nice to see them all hanging in a professional space and watch them change on the wall instead of in a drawer somewhere.
We should introduce ourselves for anyone who doesn't know.
Yeah, go for it.
All right, I'm Nicole Duquette, co-owner of Curio Gallery and Creative Supply.
Yeah, and I'm Matt Chapman, also co-owner of Curio Gallery and Creative Supply. Megan is a dear friend of ours, and we actually, Megan and I met long ago in a class together at PCAD, an adult enrichment class. But then actually our relationship goes back quite a ways. When we were looking for a studio space before opening Curio, we asked Megan if she happened to know any spaces for rent, and there was a spot right next door to her studio. So that's how we really, kind of came together. And then when Curio became a reality, we decided to pull back from that studio space and absorb that into our home. But our friendship with Megan has carried on. So we're really, really grateful to get to have her work in our space.
We miss being studio neighbors with you, Megan.
I know, me too.
These were good times.
It's always fun.
It was.
All right, so Megan, I think what a lot of people who have come into the gallery to see your works, the first thing they do is they kind of like look down at the tag and they see Foraged Inc. And they usually say that out loud, like, "Oh, Foraged Inc. I wonder what that's all about."
What does that mean?
Yeah, what does that mean? So perhaps you could talk to us a little bit about that. Like, what is Foraged Inc?
Yeah. So Foraged ink is maybe not the best term for all of the inks, but a lot of them come from berries or acorn caps or walnuts, sumac trees, things like that, like the berries off of a sumac. So literally going out and foraging for things in nature to be able to create the ink from. After they're foraged, they kind of get combined with liquid, sometimes metal, different ingredients you might have around the house, sometimes baking soda, vinegar, all different kinds of combinations. But that's really where the foraged part comes from. Some of the inks, like the blue one in particular, is really just copper with vinegar and salt in a jar for however long you have the patience to let it sit there. I mean, like months patience. It'll get darker, and as the copper corrodes, you sort of are forcing that corrosion by adding the salt and the vinegar. And so that one I wouldn't say is really foraged, but most of them tend to have some sort of foraged piece to them.
And so what is it like to go out and find those elements? Like, is that part of it, or is that kind of like a separate component to your making?
Yeah, it's more getting feedback on my end. I don't know if you guys can hear it. Now I think it stopped. It's more the idea of, I like being in nature, I like doing things outside, and I also love making art. And I feel like the combination of the two was kind of just a happy accident. I honestly had no idea where this was going when I started making inks, to be quite honest. So the other part of what I do is I have a letterpress print shop. And when I found this book about making ink, my mind immediately went to, oh my gosh, I can make my own ink and print with it on my letterpress equipment. And then in doing more research about the ink, the qualities of it, it's all basically water-based or liquid-based. It dries very quickly. It's nothing that you would ever want to put on your metal presses, or you'll corrode the crap out of all of the metal that's around, and it'll dry before you get to pull any kind of print. So it very quickly sort of took a different path. And I still thought that the process sounded like a lot of fun. But tying in that piece of being in nature and being able to go for hikes and trying to find these different plants that are around. And I feel like now I sort of start to look at things differently when we are going on walks, or I'll be like, oh my gosh, there's this wild grapevine. I have to come back for this at this time of year. So it's kind of turned those adventures into something a little bit different too. But that was, yeah, kind of all just tied together. It wasn't necessarily any one thing was the driving force. I just was excited about making the ink, and then it kind of kept going down this deeper rabbit hole.
So it sounds like you were seeking out maybe particular elements, like you're mentioning the grapevine coming back for a different time of season. Have you collected anything that you didn't know what the end result, like ink, was going to be?
So most of them, I have at least a color idea in mind, but they don't always turn out the way that I expect. Maybe would be a better way to put it. I have a couple of paintings that I used Acorn Caps for. And when I set out to make them, it really was supposed to make a gray. And it stayed brown. It didn't turn gray. I think I didn't have enough iron in it for that change to sort of happen. And I already had a brown. I was a little disappointed. It's a little bit different than my walnut brown, but still, like, you just don't know how it's going to turn out. I haven't remade that one yet, but at some point I will. I have plenty of Acorn Caps stashed away to try it again and see if it turns gray. But then I made the sumac, which I didn't expect to be gray, and it turned into this really beautiful, rich, soft gray. So if you're all looking at the paintings, the 5 in a row, the circle on the second one in from the left is made with the sumac gray. And it's just this really soft, rich, like beautiful gray. So I got my gray in a roundabout way. It just kind of, some things, it just depends what you add to them, you know, and you can kind of get a different outcome than what you expect. Some of them have been super straightforward. The copper oxide is very straightforward. You take these ingredients, you throw them in a jar, and you shake them up every once in a while, and you're going to get blue. You can add other things to it to change it. But another one that was really fun, so the ink is a safflower petal, and they're dried flower petals. And they were supposed to be a really light, but like a rich baby pink color. And I couldn't get my baking soda to be basic enough to turn them pink. So it really is like this clear yellowish color. But the thing that I love about it is because it's so basic, when you add it to other colors. So if you're looking at the paintings on the left and the right, where those crazy reactions are happening, a lot of that happens with the safflower ink because it's so basic. It just makes it reactionary when you combine it with other elements. So that's been really fun too. It wasn't the pink I was expecting, but the reaction of what happens when you add it to other inks makes it really beautiful on the page. And when you paint it on its own, like just on a sheet of paper, you can barely see it. It's not almost there at all. But over time it changes, and it again, like, makes those beautiful accidental happenings when it mixes.
Nice. Are those discoveries that kind of happen just in experimentation, or was this included in like some of your research of inks and how they interact with one another?
Not necessarily. I feel like at this point for me, the reactions are all just kind of experimental, and I just throw things on the paper and see what happens. And it's like, oh, wait, look what that ink did with that ink. And I think part of it too is that I haven't necessarily remade any colors. Like, it makes a lot of liquid, and it barely takes a lot of liquid when you're painting with them. So there's a few that I've remade just to freshen them up, but it doesn't take a ton. And I totally lost my train of thought of where I was going with that. Can you repeat your question?
I was asking if it's been more experimentational with some of the reactions of the inks together.
Okay, so I'm constantly adding new colors was where I was going with that. Like, I haven't, I'm just experimenting with new things at this point. It's like, oh, I need this color. Let me see what I can find to make that. So, and then it becomes more experimental because it's adding those colors into the palette with the old colors that I already have. So it really is just more of a playing around and experimenting to see how then they react to each other.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's like a serious type of like play, right? Like I feel like artists, we kind of talk about this idea of like playing in the studio or experimenting in the studio. And I always find it interesting to kind of get a different artist perspective on what it is to play in a studio piece or like a studio practice. And I would also think that it takes a pretty good amount of confidence to be able to just kind of like, as you said, just like put something down on the page and then see what happens and be able to react to it. I feel like that could be kind of overwhelming for somebody who's just like, oh man, like I spent all this time making this ink. I only have about this much of it, even though you said it takes very little. Like I want to make sure that what I do with this is going to work out the way I want. So I think being able to approach a blank page and just putting it down and saying, all right, let's see what we get. I think that's courageous on the part of yourself. I think that's pretty cool.
Well, I appreciate that. It's an interesting way to look at it. And I think maybe the difference really was I never approached it from a studio habit perspective. Like when I did this, it was all just kind of a thing that happened. It wasn't, I set out to make art out of it. It was just, I want to make ink and I want to see where it goes. And literally sat down one night and started throwing it on the paper. I was like, oh man, like I actually really like these. Like they were, to me, like they were cooler than what I ever expected to end up on the sheet of paper. And it was more just for me having fun making stuff because I like to make stuff. It was never about making something that other people would like or, you know, that would end up on someone's wall. Like this is beyond my wildest dreams when I started making ink. But it's gotten really fun. And the more used to you get to working with the material, the easier it is to throw it on the page and be like, oh, this is terrible, but I can still work with it and I can change it and I can, you know, do all of the things to make it a viable piece. But for all the ones that you hang on the wall, there's definitely a pile that, you know, don't see the light of day too.
I like that. I mean,
Yeah.
You were making it with the intent of just creating and experimenting and the playfulness of it. And that's sort of the nature of being an artist. You make a lot of things. You make a lot of things that aren't seen, but it sort of leads into, you know, other parts of your work. I think it's
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
And so, Megan, do you feel like was this kind of undertaking a kind of meander away from your traditional or like your usual studio practice, your design practice, or do you feel like there's a connection between the two?
I mean, definitely a connection only because I feel like anyone that studies art of any kind understands the foundation is relatively the same. Like even so in teaching at PCAD, everybody takes foundation year and they all get the same education the first year and you don't split out until your major until the second year. But that foundation year is where you learn all of the principles of design. They're the same no matter what you're making. You know, you understand contrast and balance and all of the like unity and like all of the principles that go into design. So I feel like having a background in graphic design helps all of that. And it helps you balance works on a page and put colors together. We're learning like color theory and things like that. So in that respect, it's similar. But I'd say the actual practice of it is completely different because my letterpress and my graphic design work is extremely specific. I have a very specific goal in mind and I sort of know where I'm going when I start for the most part. Where this is just like a free for all, you know, it's kind of like, these are the colors I want to work with tonight and let's see where it goes. And so in that regard, it is completely different, just the thought process and the process, the rest of the way, not just the thought process, but it is very different. It's a different feeling. It's a different approach. Like everything about it is different. So yeah, similarities and differences kind of all the way around.
Is there a particular piece in this group where you were like, I don't want to say like like it almost got away from you. But is there a piece in here where you're just like, oh man, like that's like I was really unsure of this one, but like I kind of reined it in this way, or I brought it back over?
Oh yeah, definitely. I'd say the second one from the right was, so initially when I started this, I was really just playing around with brush strokes and seeing like how the inks would interact with each other and just making like really simple strokes on a page. And then I sort of transitioned to making shapes and adding strokes. But when I start with a shape that's like, oh, I don't really like that shape, but then you add different strokes to it and different splatters, and then, you know, you see how it ends up. Yeah, that one. I think I wasn't in love with that giant gray shape that started out, but then you add other pieces to it and it's like, oh no, like it's still salvageable. It still looks cool. It still worked the way that you wanted it to. And again, the reactions I feel like sometimes are the best part, like not knowing how that's going to end up.
Did you do that kind of that centric gray shape first in this piece? Do you remember?
Yeah.
It feels like it kind of anchors the rest, and it allowed you to kind of pivot off of that with those kind of more gestural brush strokes, those arcs. And
Yeah,
then
if
that
any
form.
of the pieces that have a large piece for sure start that way. It's whatever the large solid area is would be first, and then figuring out like what can I add to that to I don't want to say fill up more space on the page, but you know, like what can I add to that to balance that shape out, but also kind of play with like adding pieces that are in contrast to like that big heavy shape, like a little bit more wispy, a little bit lighter, to kind of balance it on the page as well, and not just have like big heavy chunks everywhere.
And so is that gray, like that gray ink in the middle, is that the sumac?
Mm-hmm.
The way it lays into the paper is like
It looks like
astonishing.
velvet.
Yeah,
It
and so
looks so soft.
yeah, and that is something that, you know, like a photo representation like this just isn't quite able to capture. So being
Yeah.
able to see these in person, it does add another layer to it. But standing in front of this piece and like when you really get close to that gray ink, the way it sits into the paper, um, it's you would almost think it's like there's like an alcohol base to it, because it just kind of like sets in, but it keeps that really tight edge.
Mm-hmm.
And what's great about it is I feel like that's still pretty true to the line that you cut when you applied it, but it just has that little bit of like settling into the page. Like it's like this is where I am now, and I'm gonna like make sure I stay here. Kind of.
Yeah.
It's a really and it creates a lot of depth too. Like it goes back. It really goes back in space, and it's on such a flat sheet.
And it looks different from any other ink that I use. Like that one is the only one that has that feeling to it. Like the other ones are much more transparent. Like they're just completely different, but that one really is beautiful on the paper.
So if this piece was a kind of like a particular like a challenge, is there one that just kind of like, is there one that came together and you're like, oh yeah, that's exactly what it needed to be?
That's a good question. I don't know that any of them really happen that way. Even if I see a shape somewhere or see a thing that in my mind is like, oh, that's a great like shape, I want to see if I can incorporate that somehow. I swear it never works out. Like never works out. And it's like, oh, well, it's because you saw it and you used that as like inspiration, and but like it doesn't ever work out the way that I planned it to. And those usually are the ones that end up on the pile that no one sees. It's more the playful ones where it's just like, okay, just have fun with this and do whatever and test things out and play around, that end up working out stronger, I think, for the most part. I mean, some of the ones on the back wall, the black and so that one is pine cone and sumac and vine black on the back wall is like the three colors that were used in there. And those are much more intentional. They're much more geometric. I'd say those are more planned out than anything along the long wall. And still, I mean, some of the, like the running, like the one all the way on the left where those, it looks like 3 bars leading to the right, but if you see it up close, it's like a splotch that is just bleeding. So I feel like those some of those interactions aren't as intentional because you're not quite sure how they're going to work out. Yeah, that little ink blob there. But the dots and the shapes and the large brush stroke, like that stuff is much more intentional.
Yeah, these seem, in terms of composition, these seem much more like I don't want to say focused, but they seem like they, like you said, they have an intention to them. They have a, like they seem to have a very clear like action and reaction to them, and then there's a moment where it's like, okay, this is complete.
Yeah.
Particularly like these little orbiting kind of pieces that are around that central gray shape. Like those to me definitely seem like a reaction to the shape that you started with.
Yeah.
But it's a very controlled application of the ink.
But then there's also like this moment, I don't want to call it chaos, but it sort of is. It's this very gestural splatter, particularly in this piece, and then this next one. Ooh, not this one. Pardon me. Ooh, did I miss it?
Right
there. There it is.
Oh yeah.
This one, oh my gosh, this is Matt's favorite piece.
It is.
I must say.
Yeah.
We've had a lot of conversations.
Sorry, say that again.
Oh, so we've had a lot of conversations with people in the gallery viewing it, and this really stops them. Maybe I feel like it's for a number of reasons. This is only using one ink compared to the rest that are using multiple, but I think there's also something about the structure of this piece.
Yeah.
So this one is funny. I feel like it kind of started out more like a sketch page, that it was like, let me test out a bunch of these things and see how they work out. And then at the end, it was just like, oh, but they all look so beautiful together. And this one wasn't necessarily the most intentional. It was kind of like, let me play around with those dots and see how they go, see what happens when you put more ink or less ink on them or make them larger or smaller, and test out like what kind of brushstroke can I get with that ink. So this one is all vine black. It's just charred grapevines ground up. And if you see this one in person, it's really gritty, which is why I feel like those splatters are so dense on the page. Like it just has grit to it that you can see in front of your face. But yeah, this one really started out as more of like let's see what all of these different things do. And it was really just testing them on separate sections of the page, but they ended up working out together. So
you essentially made charcoal when you made this vine black.
Yeah, that's what vine charcoal is.
Yeah, vine charcoal is like charred grapevine. So that's really kind of beautiful when you see this one in person, is seeing that like actual texture to it, not like the texture that you've made, but the texture within the ink. It's really quite lovely seeing it in the vine black.
Yeah, and I just love the richness of the black on the white paper. I feel like I'm always drawn to this combination too, just because there's such a stark contrast. And there's something really beautiful about that, that the other ones don't have with the combinations of the other inks.
Well, it's a lot like how you're dressed this evening.
I know, I was just going to say.
That was not necessarily intentional.
I've said this a couple times to people who have been in the gallery and who are resting on this one. I found myself stopped by it because of the lower third of it. I keep trying to read it. To me, like that is like a center justified paragraph. And then it also kind of like makes me like I remove myself from the idea that they're words, and I maybe think they're just like lined up people. Like it's almost like a battleground almost, which is kind of crazy to think about. I mean, and I've also related it to Cy Twombly's paintings. He's got this really beautiful room in the Philadelphia Museum of these paintings depicting the Iliad. Yeah, and they're very chaotic. They're very like spontaneous, but they also have this really deep structure to them. And I keep feeling like this would be right at home with like a couple Cy Twombly paintings.
Oh, thanks.
But I really do love this one. I think it's fantastic.
I hate to think what they're charging into if they're moving forward, like up on that page. It looks like a bit of
yeah, but I mean that's kind of it too. Like it's definitely got like the structure of like a battle strategy, and it also has the chaos of what that could mean. So this one I think particularly, like it's got a lot of narrative to it.
Somebody was wanting to kind of particularly that lower third, wanting to read in between those repetitive marks, like looking at the negative space of this one, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
so
Very,
condensed, so
yeah.
condensed together.
I feel like I love just hearing people's reactions to all of them. You know, I see them a certain way and think of them a certain way, but it's really interesting because they're abstract. You know, there's not necessarily an image on the page, but I like to see how people interpret them and what they see.
Yeah.
And I think particularly with how they're displayed, a lot of people feel they are like scrolls.
Yeah, I did hear a couple people mention that.
So yeah, they're, for anyone who hasn't been in it, I mean, they're beautiful, kind of like these wooden bars, or what are they called? Art sticks?
No, these, I think that there is a company that makes them like
Okay,
that
that's the
too.
company.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
But yeah, these are, I mean, Megan, you can probably speak to it a little bit better. Do you like, what's the material?
Yeah, I think these ones are just oak, and it's 2 pieces of wood. There's magnets on the inside, so you kind of clamp the artwork between the magnets on both the bottom and then the top. And the top one just has holes drilled in it, and you can attach strings up to hold them. But they're nothing super fancy, which I kind of liked. I feel like sometimes frames can be really heavy and sort of detract from the art, but I like the fact that they're just naturally stained wood. I feel like it tied in really nice with the foraged ink, and the fact that most of the inks do come from nature. So just having that sort of, not raw wood, it's lightly stained, but
it's a
I like
natural
the
wood.
combination of that.
Yeah. Yeah, you're letting the materials speak for itself. It's not trying to be hidden by paint, or they're not like in a metal frame or behind like a heavy mat. I think they're just allowed to be out. And I would also imagine that like them being exposed as they are, I think that's also kind of leading to the changes in them that's happening so quickly. Which in this one particularly, which image would that be? I'll find this one.
It definitely is. Typically, I find that air and light are the things that are going to make them change the fastest. And certain colors change more than others. The pokeberry, so any of the bright pinks.
Well, yeah, this one.
Anywhere, like that one's going to change, I think, the most. The safflower also kind of fades off the page, but it's already barely there.
And so this one is actually one that we used as the promotional image. And so you actually did a great thing by capturing really high quality scans of these at like shortly after their completion. So you've got them in their like original.
Yeah.
state. And this one, and like, I think we should probably talk about pokeberry for a moment, because it's such a beautiful magenta when you first create it. And then as it oxidizes, it kind of changes into this kind of pale pink, and then it'll eventually kind of brown out into that kind of ochre color that you're starting to see in the middle. It's a really cool, it's a cool ink. And I mean, it's easy to make, and it's like it grows in the city. Like you can find it in backyards, or growing up between cracks in the sidewalk, or off like in a open lot. Like you can find this stuff.
There's definitely a bush on our block, like halfway down. Like every time I drive by it, I'm like, or walk by it, I'm like, oh my gosh, I gotta come get those.
So I mean, the fact that that a lot of these inks are made of foraged materials that were once living, and the fact that these works will change over time, that's kind of a dual meaning with why we titled the show Living Ink, because there are shifts and subtleties through just time. So we want to share. Here's that one piece. So Megan, you painted this one right before the installation in January, right?
Yep.
What's really cool, we have 2 of these pieces side by side. Megan had a digital print made for the exhibition to hang next to the original at the same size. So we've been documenting how it's shifted over, I guess now the past 5-6 weeks, which is kind of cool. So we've been dropping some in Google Drive, and I really started to notice the change probably last week, like the significant change.
Yeah, I feel like it takes a little bit until it happens, and then it almost seems like it just happens immediately, and it's just crazy.
So this was early on. This was at the very beginning of the exhibition.
Yeah, it looks like February 8th. We'll just go through. So the original is hanging on the right. Sorry if my photos aren't quite straight. I'm just noticing that now.
It's fine.
All good.
And the original painting is on the left. And here I think you can already start to see the purple of the pokeberry. And this is more purple than magenta in some of the other works, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, this one got really purple.
And you think it was from the same batch that you've been working with?
Yeah. So the whitish yellowish portion around the outer edges of that's that safflower. So it reacts immediately with the pokeberry and makes it really vibrant, like violet purple. And then it sort of all fades, and it'll fade almost probably completely off the page. But yeah, I don't know what the rhyme or reason is to sometimes why the pokeberry comes out the way that it does on a page. Sometimes it's refrigerated. Sometimes I probably let it sit out a little bit before I use it. I know I had given some to my brother, and his really turned the ochre color like in the bottle, that it was very brown even when he was painting with it then, or playing around with it. And none of mine got brown that way, but I also tend to keep mine in the refrigerator to keep it a little bit fresher. And I think he wasn't putting his in the refrigerator. But so there's all kinds of things that could play into it.
Yeah.
But that piece was really, really bright.
So this is what it looks like today,
Yeah.
which is really interesting. The purples become very soft.
Mm-hmm.
The yellow is a little more subdued, but I really love it. I love how it changes.
Yeah.
So the yellow is turmeric alcohol, and it really is just turmeric powder, again, shaken in a jar with rubbing alcohol. I think there's like a really strong variety of rubbing alcohol. And so that one smells like a cotton swab that, like, from being at the doctor when you were a kid, like before you got a shot or something. That one's fun to paint with, but it dries really quickly on the page too, with that alcohol in there. Even just in the little dish, when I pour it out, like it almost evaporates before you're done painting, because the alcohol just evaporates really quickly.
Interesting.
And yeah, I think there's also a really interesting connection, like semi-locally too, that the Ephrata cloister, they would the residents of that community would make Fractal paintings. If you're familiar with the idea, it was these really large, highly intricate ink paintings, ink drawings that usually incorporated text, but they were heavily designed, and they would use pokeberry ink. And when they were initially created, they were this rich, vibrant color, but then they would just hang them outside. And
in direct sunlight.
In direct sunlight, all through the weather. And the idea behind it was that they would spend, mass amounts of hours making these highly elaborate pieces just to hang them up and let them be taken back by nature. It wasn't the end product that was supposed to be the purpose. It was the journey of the making. Mm-hmm. So not only was like the paper itself like obliterated by just being left outside, but the ink itself would disappear. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of an interesting connection, or at least an interesting like adjacent.
Yeah. No, I love the idea of that.
And I've used this myself. I've made a large batch of pokeberry ink, and I made this really cool painting with it. And I just recently kind of resurfaced it, and it's all but gone. Mm-hmm. Just a very faint, like light ochre ghost of what the painting used to be. And I'm like, wow, that's actually kind of even cooler.
Yeah.
Really interesting thing. But just watching this change, and like being in the space every day, and Nicole and I can both attest to this, we don't notice the changes as much. But looking at them like in this quick succession, we're like, wow, yes, they've really changed. Mm-hmm. So it's pretty cool to see.
I mean, it helps to have the print beside it. So I'm not sure how maybe the other pieces have changed over the span of the past, 5 weeks or so. But this one
They
So-
definitely have. I mean, I notice them when I stop in and take a look. I know what the differences are. Well, it's like living with someone or having kids, right? You think they look the same every day, but meanwhile, like you're aging, and if you don't see someone for a while, you're like, oh man, like your kids really got big or whatever. It's the same
Mhm.
kind of thing. You just don't see the changes when you're seeing stuff every day. But yeah, I know now that I don't see them every day, I notice when I come in and I'm like, oh man, that happened to that one. Like it is interesting to see. But I feel like that was the fun of having the digital print of a brand new, fresh pokeberry one, because I knew it would change more than some of the others. And I was hoping that people would be able to see that change over the time of the exhibit.
And I would like to take a moment and talk about your prints that you have for these two, just because we were just talking about this digital print.
Mhm.
So for each one of the pieces that are in the gallery, there's a accompanying print that goes along with it, but they're not exactly like a one-to-one representation.
Mhm.
Can you talk to us a little bit about like how you decided to treat the print piece compared to the original piece?
Yeah. So I guess it was partially, I don't want to say fully happy accident, but partially a happy accident. Um, I knew, so when I started making the paintings, I started turning them into note cards and postcards because I feel like they look really beautiful all together. And so often you see something and on its own, it's beautiful, but I feel like when there's a set, like they just look really nice together. And so when I was creating the cards, I cropped the imagery on the front of the note card to sort of fit the shape, but also make it more interesting so they weren't all just floating dead center on the card. To me, I feel like that's kind of boring. Like in the world of design, that's not an interesting thing to do. So I was cropping them and just playing around with different layouts. And in creating the note card designs, I was like, wow, there's no reason I can't use this kind of cropping for an actual print. And to me, some of them are almost more beautiful. It's like, oh my gosh, like the way that's cropped on the page, and now they bleed off the edges where none of my pieces bleed off the edges, aside from like the splatter marks. It just turned into a whole different thing that was just interesting on its own. That was a little bit of a happy accident in that I wasn't planning on that for the prints, and it kind of turned into that after the note cards happened.
I also think it's a really nice way to kind of honor them both. So
Yeah.
the piece on the wall is the way that it is, and the print itself is kind of its own thing too. It's not trying to be a copy of the one that's on the wall. Like it's nice to just let it be its own thing.
Well, and if you're someone that's buying an original too, like you really know that, you've got the only one that looks exactly like that. And any of the prints, like, you could buy a print, but they're not going to be exactly the same. It really is a one of a kind
Yeah.
individual piece, which is
Yeah.
the point of buying an original, like that's the fun part of it.
Right. But that also makes the prints like originals in their own sense too. That makes them so equally special.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, let's see. So we're coming up on 7:41. Do we have any questions out there for Megan? And if you'd like to either put it in the chat, or if you feel like you'd like to pop on your microphone, you're certainly welcome to ask a question.
Megan, do you want to talk a little bit maybe about the inspiration of these works?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like it sort of goes more back to the process and kind of like we live in the city. I love living in the city. I like the hustle and bustle of a city. Like Lancaster is not a bustling city by any means, but it still is that little bit of city life. I went to school in New York, and I feel like I've always got that little bit of city in my blood. But I also love being out in the quiet nature. I feel like I grew up out there. And I also appreciate that just like dead quiet, serene landscape, like just getting away from everything. I kind of love the again, like the contrast of the two completely different atmospheres. And I feel like these kind of play perfectly into that. You've got some parts that are really controlled and really like quiet, and then you've got like the craziness of the chaos of the city life and the more sporadic, you don't know what's coming, but here it is on the page. So I kind of like how how those things play into this. And then like the ink and being like all natural and made from things in nature kind of plays into that theme. But I feel like a lot of them have that sort of dichotomy of, you know, the craziness and the calm and the two sort of lifestyles that I feel like have me split down the middle.
Yeah, they certainly feel like there's a balance of like something very static and something in motion.
Mhm.
I think the static often comes from those larger shapes that you sort of start with and it anchors the piece, and then there's movement throughout. So I love hearing a little bit about it and sort of the inspiration through the works.
Definitely. And Megan, so Keegan has asked, do you have any new inks coming up?
Yeah. I have all of the things to make an oak gall ink, and that one's going to be even blacker than the vine black. From my research, it should be black. So I'm really excited about that, just because I like that the contrast that the vine black gives, but the oak gall really should be much darker. That one, because again, it's got a lot of iron in it. Eventually it eats through the page, especially if you're using cotton paper. I think that transition will happen much quicker. So again, a whole different element being added into these that will sort of change the end result. I'm trying to think. There was another one that I wanted. I want to play around with eucalyptus, because I think it should give you that really beautiful, like sagey, soft gray green color. And I want to experiment with that. There was another color that I thought about recently, and I can't think of what it was. But yeah, I'm waiting for school to be over and having my summer to plan inks and make stuff.
I remember you mentioned looking for a particular type of berry. I don't remember the name of it though. A certain berry.
Yeah, the buckthorn. So that one's going to be like a really bright, like limey green color, and that would be fun too.
Yeah.
I also want to retry the safflower at some point to see if I can get that pink. Pink's not my favorite color, but I feel like it would work well with some of the colors that I already have. Yeah, I'm trying to think. I feel like there was another one recently that I've been thinking about, and now I can't remember what it was.
You know, I had a friend in graduate school who would make their own inks and their own pigments and things. And they collected lichen off the side of a rock, like that kind of gray black lichen. And when they boiled it, it turned into a really rich violet.
Yeah.
And like you look at it and you'd be like, why, how in the world does that make violet? But yeah, it's been pretty cool to watch. So I know I've seen some of that around too. So
that one, with the different lichens, I tried testing it out, and the lichen that I collected was not the right one. But then I found that there's a quick test that you can take like a tiny piece of the lichen and just scrape it with a knife or something sharp, like scrape the outer coating off. And you can pour, it's either alcohol or vinegar. I'd have to look at my notes, but one of them, if you pour it on and it immediately quickly turns that bright fluorescent purple, you know that that's the one that's going to change to that color when you make your pigment. I've not been able to find the right one yet, but I know it exists and I know it's out there.
Yeah, just keep like a little dropper, like a little rubber dropper of vinegar with you, and you can just
everywhere.
And so in the chat we have Sam says that Megan, beautiful exhibit. We're loving our prints. Thank you for making this available. Yeah, they actually shared with us an image of their new pieces hanging in their home, and they are gorgeous.
Oh, awesome. Thank you.
They used a very similar hanging method to yours, but they've actually found a way to clip both of them to one central bar. So it's like a double stack on one.
Oh, nice.
One anchor. It looks really gorgeous.
That sounds very cool. I like the idea of that.
And so, actually, I just had a question just sitting here looking at them and thinking about what you're talking about, how like they follow the principles of design, and you were thinking of initially making these to use to like pull prints. It would be like I'd love to see like what this would look like if you were to lay this ink down on the sheet first and then run it through a press with like another like with different variety of true like printmaking inks. Like I think this could be a really great kind of like
I feel like
foundation for another print on top.
I know. So I know like we've talked about this a couple of times, and I feel like I struggle in my head to see how it's going to look. And that's part of the problem. I've played around with a couple of them. I put a bunch of copper on a couple of different sheets in weird random places, and then just ran it through with, I have gray ink, and I think it was all just random numbers or letters kind of on top of it. And then I'd use those and cut them up and use them in collages for other things, and kind of they took on a form of their own. But I also want to do that, and I'm not sure what it looks like yet. I feel like for me, things like that kind of happen. Like I know where I'm going, at least have an idea of where I'm going. And in this situation, I know that I want to do it. I just have no idea what that end thing looks like, and I don't know how to get there. I feel like one day it'll just pop in my head and be like, oh my gosh, this is it. But I'm not sure how that happens yet.
It's a great feeling when that happens too. When you're finally like,
Yeah.
oh, there it is. Yes,
Yep.
of course. That's been staring at me forever.
Let it
Yeah.
simmer in the background, because I know we've talked about this for a couple of years now.
Yeah.
Sparked this idea. So it's in the back of your mind, and it'll happen when it's.
I feel like it'll be great when it does. It's just, yeah, what does it look like?
Yeah. But it has been really great to listen to people in the gallery kind of like talking with one another about like what they see in them. It's gone everywhere from like if they feel like they're underwater to they're like in the clouds. I mean, it's been really cool to see just the range of where people go with it.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Oh, so question just popped in. It says, what is the future of Foraged Inc? Or what is in the future for Foraged Inc? Are you going to continue?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it seems like every time I sit down, I can't seem to redo the same thing twice. It's kind of like every time I sit down, something different like comes out of me onto the page. I know it's weird, but I don't know that I could even replicate things that I've done. Like if someone's like, oh, I really like that, but I want it in these colors. Like, I don't know that it would happen that way. It's kind of just like, this is how I'm feeling tonight, and that's what ends up on the page. So the night that I sat down to make the fresh print or the fresh painting for the show to compare the pokeberry, I was trying to use up the little bit of ink that I had left, and I just quick did like these squiggly drawings on the page, and I was like, oh my gosh, this just turned into a whole other thing. And I ended up pouring more ink out and making a whole bunch more paintings, like just based on that little, I was just trying to get rid of ink at that point, because I refused to throw it away. It's like, put something on the paper. So I feel like that's kind of how it happens, is just more experimentation. And every time, it's something new and something different. But that's the fun of it, so I don't know that I'll be stopping anytime soon. But I probably also won't be recreating much of anything that I've already got.
Oh, I like seeing, I mean, you just shared, I guess maybe a series of paintings within like the same palette of that purple piece titled like 601. You shared a whole bunch. And they're very different from the works in the exhibition and even your past works that aren't in the show, but kind of see your hand in it and kind of repeating movements. And but you're kind of discovering new elements. So I love it because it's sort of like a fresh perspective using the inks that you already have on hand and kind of looking at it in a new lens. Love it.
I feel like two different color combinations make me feel differently and make me see things differently and make me, want to paint things differently. Like, I don't know that the paintings that are on the screen now, I don't know that I would do that with another color combination. It just really worked for those. So sometimes I'm just like, oh, I'm just going to use these 2 or 3 inks, this time. And it's just depends on how that combination strikes me. And I don't know.
I love that sort of limitation of giving yourself maybe something like limiting, just, yeah, limiting yourself, like, I'm going to work with this select palette and that's it, and kind of push the boundaries of what they can interact with one another and how that looks.
Yeah.
I feel like it kind of started once I got over 10 inks. It's like, oh my gosh, well, I can't pour all of these out. And I tend to go back to certain ones more than others. So that's when I really started limiting, like, I'm just going to use these colors this time and see how it works. I also, you know, I understand color, and I tend to think that I have a good eye for color combinations and those types of things. So limiting it that way is just sort of natural for me. You know, I'm just sticking with these 2 or 3, as opposed to wanting all 12 or 13 or 14 on one sheet. Starts to turn into a clown car, you know.
I mean, that's an interesting thought. Is there a color that you've made that you're just like, oh no, like you are not really the color I would ever want to use?
It really has turned into like the browns, like the walnut is a darker brown and the acorn is a slightly lighter brown, and they're probably the 2 that I shy away from the most. I also feel like I'm in a very gray phase of my life. Like I just like gray is my go-to color for everything because it goes with everything. And I really like gray right now. So I feel like the brown is just sort of like, it just looks dead to me. Like it's just like, nah, it's such a mood killer for some reason. So I feel like I really struggle to use brown. And even when I do use it, it's like, oh, why did I do that? Like, why did I even attempt it? Like, it's just brown.
Because like I'm looking at the pieces that are on the screen now, and like that kind of sepia, yeah, like man, it's such a lively color. Like it
So
almost,
that
it almost
one,
sets off.
that one is pine cone, and I like that one. It's a totally different brown. It's a little bit more orangey than the other 2, but I really enjoy the pine cone brown. So maybe it's not just the brown; it's just the shade of those other 2. They just are meh.
And so Lydia's asked if you're able to use mushrooms to make a foraged ink.
Hi, Lydia. That's a great question. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know that I
I've
have
ever
an
seen
answer.
anything about that.
I've seen like onion skins being used to create a dye, at least a dye, or
I've got some with onion skin. There might be one that has a little bit of it in the show. I forget. It didn't get as dark as I wanted. It's like a very watery yellow brown color. It just wasn't as rich as I had hoped.
I'd almost imagine that you can probably you can make a pigment, or you can make a solution out of almost anything if you have the right binder for it. So like, I wonder if like whatever color a ground mushroom were to turn into, if you mix it with like the right gum arabic or the right amount of like a binder to it, you could probably make a pretty interesting medium with it. I would be interested to try it. It just makes me want to go out and find a whole bunch of stuff and see what colors I can get. Yeah.
I feel like too with the mushrooms, I'm thinking more of like those black puff balls.
Yeah.
Like if you use that, I feel like that might give you like a richer ink than say like a regular white mushroom. You know, mushrooms tend to not have a whole lot of pigment to them. I feel like when you cut them open, the fleshy part is really mostly white. But there's got to be some out there that would react to some sort of, really, it would just be a chemical reaction, you know.
That puffball is pretty cool. We've seen some pretty vibrant mushroom caps out there. There's some really bright reds, and
I
think they change in a matter of hours. That'd be interesting.
Which could be really cool.
But I have seen onion skins, I think avocado pits.
Yes, I have a bunch with that. It makes like a blush pink. That one's one of my favorites too.
That's
really
cool.
Beautiful.
Amazing to think that all these things that are common and semi-uncommon, that make these just absolutely gorgeous colors, and you'd have no idea. But there's somebody out there who discovered it and then shared it with somebody else, and it becomes knowledge if you look for it. I think that's such a fascinating thing about mediums.
Yeah, I have found that most of it comes from fabric dyes. Like most of the research that I've done in looking to make pigments is typically based in fabric dyes because it's been around for thousands of years. And you know, people today still use the same ingredients that they used thousands of years ago. So that's typically where most of it starts. And then you're just putting it on a page with a brush instead of dipping a piece of fabric into it. You know, it really is the same thing. Just depends on how concentrated it is.
Well, we're quickly approaching 8 o'clock, and I think this has been a great talk. Like it's made me like, luckily we're up here in our own studio. It's made me want to just go out and like make things, like just go try and experiment and have fun, and see what kind of serious play you can develop out of that. And it's been great. We've loved having your work in the gallery. We will have it up through the 27th.
Yes.
So if you haven't been able to come in and see the exhibition, feel free. You're certainly welcome to come in and visit us during our open hours. We keep it nice and safe with a 6-person limit, and we do ask that you wear your masks, so we keep everything very, very safe. But it's been great, and like having these works on the walls. And I feel like I say this about all of our exhibitions, but it's changed the space. It's not been like anything we've had in the gallery before, and I don't think it will be like anything we'll have in the gallery in the future. It's just been really, it's an awesome experience, and they're gorgeous. We love seeing them all together.
Thank you. Thank you guys again. I appreciate you having them in there.
Yeah. Well, Megan, is there anything you'd like to say before we sign off for the evening?
I don't think so.
All right. Well,
Thank you everyone for showing up.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys all for taking the time out of your evenings to join us. It's been really nice to see you all, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next one.